A racist manager bullies a young black employee, believing that the young man does not belong in the company and doubting his qualifications. He continuously undermines the employee's efforts, confident in his authority and assumptions. However, the manager's world is turned upside down when he is unexpectedly summoned to the CEO's office, only to discover a truth that leaves him stunned. The young black employee has a connection to the CEO that changes everything. Marcus Johnson stood outside the impressive glass facade of Sterling Solutions, the towering corporate building casting long shadows in the early morning light. He drew in a steadying breath, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension swirl within him. Today marked the beginning of his internship, a position he had earned through relentless hard work. Yet, he was well aware of the challenges that came with being one of the few black men in a predominantly white corporate environment. He was no stranger to the unspoken doubts and preconceived notions he would have to face. The elevator doors chimed as they opened, welcoming him to the 25th floor, where the firm's headquarters buzzed with energy. Marcus stepped inside, adjusting his tie with a sense of purpose. What no one knew was that he was the son of Thomas Johnson, the respected CEO of Sterling Solutions. They had mutually agreed to keep this a secret. Marcus wanted to establish himself on merit alone, free from the shadow of nepotism. As the elevator ascended, Marcus mentally prepared for what lay ahead. He wasn't expecting special treatment, but he also wasn't prepared for the subtle and not-so-subtle slights that would soon test him. The doors slid open, revealing a sleek, bustling office with glass walls and modern decor. Amidst the hum of ringing phones and soft chatter stood Alan Turner, the regional manager known for his no-nonsense approach and imposing demeanor. Alan's sharp eyes fixed on Marcus as he stepped off the elevator. Tall and broad-shouldered, with thinning hair, Alan exuded an air of superiority, the corner of his lips curling into a smirk as he walked over. He didn't bother with pleasantries, nor did he extend a handshake. "So you're Marcus Johnson," Alan said, his voice carrying a note of mocking formality. "Looks like we've got ourselves a diversity intern." His eyes glinted with thinly veiled contempt, unaware of Marcus's true identity. The statement hung in the air, a test Marcus had seen too many times before. Marcus held his gaze, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, sir? I'm ready to start." Alan's smile widened slightly as if he enjoyed the unspoken power he believed he wielded. "Let's hope that's true. Around here, we don't have time to coddle anyone. You're here to prove you're not a waste of space. Got it?" Marcus nodded, swallowing the initial sting of Alan's words. This was his chance to prove himself, and he wasn't going to let anyone shake his resolve. He had faced harder battles to get here, and this was just the beginning. Alan turned briskly, motioning for Marcus to follow. The office tour was short and clipped, marked by dismissive explanations and quick glances that told Marcus just how little Alan thought of him. When they reached the cramped cubicle tucked into a corner, Alan gestured with a flourish that was more derisive than welcoming. "Here's your desk. Not much, but I guess it'll do for someone like you," Alan said, the sneer in his voice unmistakable. "Let's see if you can keep up without dragging the rest of us down." Marcus met Alan's eyes, a flicker of determination igniting within him. He gave a polite nod. "I'll do my best." The day had barely started, and Marcus already knew this was going to be more than just an internship. It was going to be a battle. But he was ready for it. Marcus settled into his corner cubicle, trying to push aside the sting of Alan's introduction. The space was tight and sparse, tucked far from the main walkway where the rest of the interns had desks with views and chatter. The seclusion wasn't lost on Marcus, who could feel the symbolic isolation of being placed out of sight. He logged into his computer and began familiarizing himself with the day's tasks, focusing on each detail with the meticulousness that had gotten him here in the first place. The morning passed quietly until Alan's shadow fell across Marcus's desk. Without looking up, Marcus felt the weight of Alan's presence and sensed the smirk that likely accompanied it. Alan's voice sliced through the hum of the office, laced with condescension. "Marcus," Alan said, drawing out his name as if savoring it, "how's the first day treating you? Settling in, all right, or is it too much already?" Marcus looked up, meeting Alan's gaze. "I'm doing well, thank you." Just getting into the workflow. Alan's eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of hesitation or discomfort. Finding none, he dropped a stack of reports onto Marcus's desk with a thud. Good, then you won't mind starting on these. They need revisions, and I expect them back by the end of the day. Marcus nodded, masking his frustration as he glanced at the daunting pile of work. It was more than what any of the other interns had on their desks, he noticed, but he kept his thoughts to himself. I'll get it done, he said evenly. Alan leaned in, his expression shifting from a smirk to something colder. See that you do. You might think you've got a foot in the door, but this place isn't about ticking boxes for diversity. You'll need more than good intentions to stick around. The insinuation was clear, but Marcus refused to let it shake him. He turned back to the reports, ignoring the snickers he could hear from a couple of nearby interns who had caught Alan's not-so-subtle jab. They didn't know who he was, and Marcus intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. The hours stretched on as Marcus pored over the reports, double-checking every calculation and ensuring each revision met Sterling Solutions' high standards. Alan passed by a few more times, each appearance punctuated by an unnecessary comment or an exaggerated sigh. It was a game of intimidation, one Marcus knew all too well. When lunchtime came, Marcus opted to stay at his desk, determined to finish the revisions before the deadline. As he worked, he noticed the glances from the other interns and employees. Some were curious, others indifferent, but a few more expressions that echoed Alan's skepticism. They were waiting for him to slip, to confirm their unspoken assumptions. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had completed the first batch of revisions. He stood, reports in hand, and made his way to Alan's office. The manager was sitting back in his chair, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. He looked up, surprise flitting across his face for a moment before it hardened back into his usual disinterest. Done already? Alan said, one eyebrow raised. Yes, Marcus replied, setting the stack on Alan's desk. Alan picked up the reports, flipping through a few pages. His lips pursed as he read, looking for errors or any reason to criticize. Finding none, he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. Not bad, Alan admitted, the compliment feeling more like a concession than genuine praise. But let's see if you can keep that up. One good start doesn't mean you're cut out for this. Marcus nodded, his expression neutral. Understood. Alan's eyes narrowed again, as if trying to decipher the calm that Marcus maintained so effortlessly. With a dismissive wave of his hand, Alan returned to his phone, signaling the end of the interaction. Marcus walked out, feeling the quiet swell of victory in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he was here. He was ready to take whatever came next. The afternoon sun cast long slants of light across the office floor as Marcus settled back into his desk. The faint hum of conversation and clatter of keyboards filled the air, a white noise that Marcus found oddly soothing. Despite Alan's dismissive behavior, completing the initial round of revisions had given him a sense of accomplishment. But that moment of satisfaction was fleeting. Barely an hour had passed when Alan reappeared, a slight scowl on his face as he strode across the room with determined steps. This time, he wasn't alone. A few interns nearby glanced up, their curiosity piqued by the purposeful way Alan approached Marcus's desk. He held another stack of documents, thicker than the last, and dropped them with a loud thump that made several heads turn. More revisions? Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady. Alan's lips curled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. You catch on quick, don't you? His voice dripped with sarcasm. These need to be redone before you leave today. And make sure you follow the formatting guidelines this time. I won't accept sloppy work. Marcus bit back a retort, choosing instead to nod. I'll take care of it. Alan lingered a moment longer, as if hoping to provoke a reaction, then turned and walked away, already talking over his shoulder. Good. Don't let me down, Marcus. Once Alan was out of earshot, Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders dissipate slightly. The other interns exchanged glances, a few shaking their heads in sympathy, while others smirked knowingly. Marcus could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. He's not going to last. The hours ticked by, marked only by the quiet rustle of paper and the rhythmic clicking of keys as Marcus worked through the new set of revisions. This time, the work was more complicated. The data denser. Alan had chosen this batch specifically to push Marcus, to see if he would falter under the pressure. But Marcus had a point to prove, not just to Alan, but to himself. He wasn't here because of any quota. He was here because he had earned it. He approached each report with precision, triple-checking the numbers and ensuring the formatting adhered to Sterling Solutions' rigorous standards. The task was grueling, and fatigue began to creep into his bones, but he refused to let it show. A few desks over, one of the interns, Julia, a sharp-eyed woman known for her competitive streak, watched him with a mix of intrigue and skepticism. She leaned over to another intern and whispered something, their eyes darting toward Marcus. He caught the exchange out of the corner of his eye, but kept his focus on his work. Finally, as the sky outside deepened to shades of purple and blue, Marcus placed the last revised report onto the completed stack. He stood, stretched his stiff muscles, and gathered the documents to deliver them to Alan's office. The corridor was quieter now, with many employees having already left for the day. The solitude was a small reprieve, a moment to center himself before facing Alan's likely criticism. Knocking on the door, Marcus waited for Alan's curt, "Come in," before entering. Alan looked up from his desk, his expression neutral until he saw the stack in Marcus's arms. Surprise flickered in his eyes for a split second before his usual mask of indifference returned. "Finished already?" Alan asked, a touch of disbelief in his tone. Marcus placed the papers down and nodded. "Yes, I made sure everything was up to standard." Alan picked up the first report, skimming through it with deliberate slowness, searching for any flaw he could seize upon. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the occasional flip of a page. Finally, he set the report down and met Marcus's gaze. "Acceptable," he said, the words sounding grudging. "You're still here, so I suppose that's something." Marcus allowed himself a small, controlled smile. "I aim to meet expectations." Alan's eyes narrowed slightly at the comment, as though trying to decide if Marcus was being defiant or simply respectful. Without another word, he waved Marcus off. Walking back to his desk, Marcus felt the weight of the day begin to lift. The first day had been brutal, but he was still standing. This was just the beginning, and he was prepared for the road ahead. Go back. The early morning light seeped through the office blinds as Marcus arrived the next day, his mind already bracing for whatever challenge Alan would throw at him. The memory of the previous day's struggles and subtle hostility still lingered, but Marcus pushed it aside, reminding himself of his purpose. He was here to prove his worth, not just to others, but to himself. As he settled into his seat, Marcus noticed a few interns casting glances in his direction. Some curious, others indifferent. The office bustled to life with the hum of phone calls and the tapping of keyboards. It was a dance Marcus was growing familiar with, each step designed to test his resolve. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the task at hand. Alan entered the office, his presence as commanding as ever. He walked with a measured pace, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marcus. A flicker of something, challenge, perhaps, crossed his features as he strode over. A thick report, clutched in his hand. "Marcus," Alan said, his tone devoid of any warmth, "this needs to be reviewed and cross-referenced with last quarter's data. I expect it by noon." Marcus looked at the report, realizing immediately that the task was an extensive one. He met Alan's eyes and nodded. "Understood." Alan's gaze hardened as if disappointed not to see hesitation or fear. "Let's hope so," he muttered before turning away. The morning blurred into a focused frenzy of numbers, cross-checks, and detailed notes. Marcus's fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, his eyes scanning line after line of data. He could feel the familiar thrum of determination rising in him, pushing back against the fatigue gnawing at his mind. At one point, Julia, the competitive intern, approached and paused at the edge of his cubicle. Her gaze was calculating as she leaned against the partition. "He's really piling it on, isn't he?" she said, half amused, half sympathetic. Marcus looked up, masking his weariness with a polite smile. "Just part of the job," he replied. Julia tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "Maybe, but it's obvious he's got a thing against you. Don't let him grind you down." The comment, though unexpected, settled heavily in Marcus's chest. He nodded, offering a quiet "thanks" before she moved on. It was the first direct acknowledgement from anyone that Alan's behavior was out of line. For a brief moment, Marcus felt less alone in his battle. By the time noon approached, Marcus's desk was a maze of highlighted papers, notes scribbled in the margins, and stacks of completed pages. He gathered everything, double-checked his work, and walked toward Alan's office. The tension coiled in his stomach as he knocked and stepped inside. Alan looked up, eyes widening, almost imperceptibly as Marcus placed the completed report on his desk. He lifted an eyebrow but said nothing, picking up the first few sheets to inspect them. Minutes passed, each one dragging longer than the last. Marcus stood there, his expression carefully neutral, as Alan flipped through the report. Finally, Alan placed the papers down and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Decent," he said, the grudging acknowledgement barely a compliment, "but don't expect this to get any easier." Marcus nodded once. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Alan's eyes sharpened, as though searching for a hint of sarcasm. When he found none, he waved Marcus out dismissively. The subtle exchange was enough to tell Marcus that Alan was aware of his resolve and was now deciding how to dismantle it next. Marcus returned to his desk, the weight of Alan's words settling around him like a challenge. But this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like fuel. He knew Alan wouldn't stop pushing, but Marcus wasn't about to falter. He had faced obstacles before, and he would face this one head-on. Because Marcus wasn't just there to survive, he was there to win. The steady pace of the office turned into a more frenzied hum as the week continued. Sterling Solutions was gearing up for a major client presentation, and the pressure was palpable. Employees hurried from desk to desk, exchanging documents and muttered advice, while the interns, eager to prove their worth, worked at a near-breakneck pace. Marcus found himself more immersed than ever, the expectations high and the scrutiny even higher. Alan, true to form, didn't let the urgency of the upcoming presentation change his approach. If anything, the increased stakes seemed to invigorate him, pushing him to find more ways to test Marcus's limits. By midweek, Marcus had been assigned to compile and analyze a complex data report that would be a key component of the presentation. The task required precision, as a single oversight could undermine the entire team's credibility. The silence in the office was shattered when Alan called out across the room, his voice cutting through the din. "Marcus, I hope you're on track with that report. We don't have time for delays or do-overs." Marcus felt the eyes of the nearby interns shift to him, some curious, others expectant. He met Alan's gaze across the room, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm almost done," he responded, keeping his voice calm. "Almost doesn't count," Alan said with a smirk, folding his arms as if to punctuate his authority. The remark drew a few sidelong glances from other employees who quickly pretended to be absorbed in their work. The tension hung thick in the air, and Marcus could almost hear the silent judgment. But Marcus had anticipated this. He had spent the night before meticulously preparing, double-checking figures and reviewing data sets until his vision blurred. With each challenge Alan threw his way, Marcus felt his resolve harden further. He wasn't here to meet Alan's expectations. He was here to exceed them. By late afternoon, Marcus finally finished. He stood the finished report in hand and made his way to Alan's office. The hall felt longer than usual, lined with the murmurs of colleagues engaged in last-minute preparations for the presentation. When he arrived, Alan was in conversation with another manager, his expression animated until his eyes landed on Marcus. Alan's lips thinned into a tight line. "What is it, Marcus?" he asked, feigning annoyance as he took the report. "I've completed the analysis for the presentation," Marcus said, standing tall. Alan's eyebrows shot up, and he took the report with a barely concealed look of surprise. He glanced at the first few pages, eyes scanning the lines quickly. He set the document down and looked up at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read, part begrudging acknowledgement, part irritation. "Well, you're on time," Alan admitted, his tone begrudging, "but just being on time doesn't make you irreplaceable." Marcus held his gaze. "I understand," he replied, voice even. Alan leaned back, crossing his arms. The silence between them was charged as if Alan was daring Marcus to break. When he didn't, Alan's smirk faltered, and he gave a dismissive nod. "You're dismissed." As Marcus turned to leave, he noticed that the usual murmur in the office had died down. The other interns and employees were either pretending not to listen or stealing subtle glances. He felt the pressure of their attention, but this time, it didn't bother him. He walked back to his desk with a sense of quiet satisfaction, aware that he had done his part and done it well. The remainder of the day was a blur of preparations. Marcus kept his head down, working methodically even as Alan made his rounds, delivering sharp-edged comments to whomever he deemed worthy of his attention. But Marcus noticed that Alan's gaze lingered on him a second longer each time, as if calculating the next move. Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was only a matter of time before Alan's relentless attempts to discredit him would escalate. But as the clock wound down and the office began to clear out, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. In a company that demanded excellence, Marcus was ready to show that he could not only keep up but stand out, no matter how many times Alan tried to dim his light. The following day began with a tangible buzz in the air as Sterling Solutions geared up for the client presentation. The office was a hive of activity, and every team member felt the weight of the day. Marcus arrived early, his mind sharp and focused despite the restless night he'd spent replaying yesterday's encounters. He wasn't just preparing himself to complete tasks, he was preparing to withstand whatever Alan would hurl his way. Mid-morning, Marcus glanced up to find Alan scanning the office like a hawk. Their eyes met for a moment, and Marcus saw the familiar glint of challenge. Alan crossed the room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor as he approached Marcus's desk. "Marcus," Alan began, his voice edged with almost casual disdain, "I need you to run one last check on the figures before the presentation. We can't afford mistakes, and I don't need to remind you what happens if there are any." Marcus nodded, his face impassive. "I'll take care of it." Alan's eyes narrowed slightly as if Marcus's calm acceptance bothered him. "Good," Alan said after a beat, before turning on his heel and walking away, his presence still looming long after he left. Marcus turned back to his computer, eyes scanning the numbers with precision. He could feel the office's tension like an electric current, colleagues moving around with clipped movements, conversations kept to low murmurs. But Marcus thrived on this kind of pressure. It pushed him to be meticulous, driven by an internal fire that Alan's attempts at belittlement only fueled. An hour before the presentation, Marcus finished his final review, correcting a minor discrepancy that could have been overlooked but which could have led to awkward questions during the meeting. He forwarded the updated report to Alan and went back to his desk, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Shortly after, the office buzzed with the arrival of senior executives and the high-profile clients they were set to impress. Alan stood at the forefront of the team, exuding confidence that bordered on arrogance, fully ready to take credit for Marcus's painstaking efforts. Marcus didn't mind. He knew that recognition wasn't won easily, and that today's goal was simply to hold his ground. The presentation began smoothly, with Alan guiding the clients through the prepared slides. Everything went as planned until one of the clients, a sharp-eyed man with a penchant for detail, posed a complex question about the data analysis. Alan hesitated, the brief moment of uncertainty sending a ripple of discomfort through the room. Marcus, sitting toward the back, saw the opportunity. He stood, the eyes of both colleagues and clients shifting to him. "If I may," Marcus said, his voice steady, "I can clarify that point." Alan's eyes flashed with irritation, but he stepped aside, masking it with a forced smile. Marcus walked to the front, the weight of scrutiny on him. He explained the data succinctly, breaking down the numbers and methodology with confidence. When he finished, the client nodded, satisfied, and the tension in the room lessened. There was a subtle murmur of approval from a few executives, and even Alan's strained smile couldn't mask the defeat in his eyes. "Well done," he said, his voice flat. "Let's move on." The remainder of the presentation proceeded without incident, but Marcus felt the shift. He had stepped up when it mattered most, and people had noticed. After the meeting, as the clients were shown out, a few employees shot Marcus appreciative looks, and even Julia passed by with an approving nod. Alan, however, cornered Marcus by the water cooler, his face a mask of barely restrained anger. "Don't think that little performance means anything," Alan hissed, his eyes darting around to ensure no one overheard. You might have saved the presentation, but this isn't over. You're still just here to fill a quota. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he held Alan's gaze. I'm here because I deserve to be, and today proved it. Alan's expression darkened, but he said nothing, storming off instead. Marcus watched him go, feeling the slight victory settle in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push him forward. He wasn't just surviving, he was beginning to carve out his place. Today had been a small win, but it was only the start. The days following the presentation were a whirlwind of tasks and meetings, and Marcus felt a subtle shift in the way people interacted with him. Some interns who had previously kept their distance now offered brief smiles or nodded in acknowledgement. The office gossip had clearly caught wind of how Marcus had stepped in to salvage the presentation, and though no one spoke openly about it, the change was palpable. But if Marcus thought this newfound respect would make things easier, Alan was quick to disprove that notion. The manager's irritation was barely concealed as he continued to find ways to undercut Marcus's progress. Alan's tactics shifted from overt disdain to more insidious strategies, assigning impossible deadlines, piling on mundane busywork, and finding reasons to question Marcus's competence in meetings. Marcus, Alan called out one afternoon, drawing the attention of a few nearby employees. He waved a thick folder at Marcus, eyes narrowed. This report needs a full overhaul. I need it by tomorrow morning. Marcus's eyes flickered to the wall clock. It was already late in the day. The task Alan was referring to was massive, a project that would typically take a team days to complete. The challenge wasn't lost on Marcus, but he simply nodded. Understood. Alan's smirk returned, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face as he turned away. Don't stay up too late, he tossed over his shoulder, the mockery in his tone unmistakable. The office thinned out as the evening wore on, the once busy space now filled with the quiet hum of electronics and the faint clatter of Marcus's fingers on the keyboard. He worked with unyielding focus, eyes glued to the screen as he cross-referenced data, reformatted tables, and meticulously checked for accuracy. Fatigue crept in, but Marcus refused to let it slow him down. He had endured harder nights during university, where balancing coursework and part-time jobs had been routine. Hours passed, and Marcus finally leaned back in his chair, stretching his stiff neck and shoulders. The final document gleamed on his screen, thorough and complete. He sent it off to Alan's email, noting the time. Just past 2 a.m. With a sigh of relief, Marcus gathered his things and left the dimly lit office, the cool night air outside offering a brief, rejuvenating breath. The next morning, Marcus arrived slightly earlier than usual, a steaming coffee in hand, and exhaustion hidden behind a practiced smile. He sat at his desk, ready for whatever came next. Alan walked in not long after, his eyes narrowing when he saw Marcus already settled in. Without a word, Alan made a beeline for his office, but not before Marcus noticed him glancing at his phone, likely to check for Marcus's email. An hour later, Alan called Marcus into his office. The manager sat behind his desk, the report open in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but Marcus knew better than to expect praise. Marcus, Alan began, tapping the corner of the report. You met the deadline, I'll give you that. His voice dripped with begrudging acknowledgement. But you should know that meeting deadlines is just the start. Excellence is what matters. Marcus met Alan's gaze, understanding the subtext. No matter how hard he worked, Alan would continue to move the goalposts, ensuring that Marcus felt like he was always one step behind. But Marcus's resolve was ironclad. He nodded calmly. I'm committed to excellence. Alan's mouth twitched, a mix of irritation and something close to respect flashing in his eyes before disappearing. We'll see, he muttered, turning back to his computer as a clear dismissal. Walking back to his desk, Marcus caught Julia's eye. She gave him a small thumbs up, the simple gesture bolstering his spirit more than she could have known. He smiled back, the silent exchange reminding him that he wasn't entirely alone in this battle. The rest of the day was a series of minor tasks, meetings, and the occasional sharp comment from Alan. But Marcus pushed through, each moment fueling the fire of his determination. He had survived another round of Alan's tests, and though his patience was being stretched thin, he felt stronger for it. Alan's tactics were relentless. But Marcus was beginning to understand that resilience wasn't just enduring the storm, it was learning to thrive within it. And as he watched Alan pass by with his usual air of superiority, Marcus knew that this battle was far from over. But he was ready, and he wasn't backing down. Bookmark, go back. The following week, tension rippled through Sterling Solutions as the team geared up for another high-stakes client presentation. This time, the stakes felt even higher. Alan had tasked Marcus with preparing a comprehensive dataset that would serve as the backbone of the pitch. The pressure was immense, and Marcus knew that any slip could give Alan the ammunition he needed to discredit him in front of everyone. Marcus's desk had become a fortress of notes, charts, and highlighted reports. He worked late into the evenings, the glow of his computer screen reflecting the determination etched on his face. The constant hum of the office seemed to fade as he delved deeper into his work, mentally rehearsing the numbers and analysis, making sure everything aligned perfectly. He had no room for error, not with Alan watching his every move. The day of the presentation dawned, and Marcus walked into the office feeling the familiar knot of anticipation in his stomach. The meeting room had been prepped to impress. Polished glass table, strategically placed company portfolios, and a sleek projector waiting to showcase the visuals Marcus had labored over. Executives began filing in, their conversations punctuated by polite laughter and the rustle of suit jackets. Alan stood at the front, a self-assured smile on his face, ready to bask in the spotlight of his team's efforts. Marcus took a seat near the back, his nerves simmering beneath his practiced calm. He noticed Julia shoot him an encouraging look, which he returned with a slight nod. The room quieted as Alan began, his voice commanding attention as he walked the clients through the initial stages of the presentation. For the first half hour, everything ran smoothly. Alan delivered the talking points with his usual confidence, a performance polished by years of practice. But Marcus could see that Alan's confidence was more show than substance. The deeper technical insights were glossed over, teetering dangerously on vague explanations. And then it happened. One of the clients, a meticulous man with keen eyes, posed a question about the comparative growth data. Alan's practiced smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "That's an excellent question," he said, clearing his throat as he glanced at the chart on the screen. But it was clear he didn't have the answer. Marcus felt the tension spike as the room shifted, all eyes moving from Alan to the screen, waiting. This was the moment he had prepared for. Before the silence could stretch any more uncomfortably, Marcus stood. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice clear and steady. He walked to the front, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. Alan's jaw tensed, but he stepped aside, unable to object without looking unprepared. Marcus addressed the client directly. "I can explain the comparative growth data. If you look here," he gestured to the highlighted section on the screen, "you'll see that we accounted for market fluctuations over the last 3 quarters, which impacted projections. The variances you're noticing are due to a shift in the client demographic, outlined here in the detailed breakdown." The client's eyes lit up as Marcus spoke, nodding along with the explanation. When Marcus finished, a murmur of approval rippled through the room, and several executives exchanged looks of quiet admiration. Alan forced a tight smile, clapping a hand on Marcus's shoulder with feigned joviality. "Excellent work, Marcus. That's what I like to see from my team." But Marcus didn't miss the way Alan's fingers tightened slightly, the subtle show of frustration that Marcus had, once again, proven him wrong. The presentation wrapped up smoothly, with the client satisfied and the tension easing as people began to rise from their seats. As the room emptied, Alan cornered Marcus by the exit, his expression dark. "Don't let that get to your head," Alan hissed. "You might think today's a win, but you're still just filling a quota. One good day doesn't change that." Marcus met Alan's glare with a calm that belied the adrenaline still coursing through him. "I'm here to do my job, and I'll keep proving that, whether you like it or not." Alan's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, one of the senior executives called him over, ending the confrontation. Marcus watched Alan walk away, the tightness in his chest slowly loosening. He knew this was far from over, but today he had shown not just Alan but the entire team what he was capable of, and that was a victory he would hold on to. The atmosphere in the office had shifted subtly after the presentation. Although Alan tried to maintain his grip on authority, Marcus could sense that some of the power had shifted. Colleagues who once kept their distance now nodded or offered brief words of acknowledgement when they passed by. Even Julia, who Marcus knew respected no one easily, stopped by his desk the next day. "Good job in the presentation," she said, her tone more sincere than he'd expected. Not everyone would have stepped up like that. Marcus offered a small smile. "Thanks, Julia. Just doing what needed to be done." She nodded and moved on, leaving Marcus with a quiet sense of validation. But he knew better than to let down his guard. Alan's frustration had been palpable, and it was only a matter of time before he made another move. True to form, Alan's next attack came quickly. By the end of the week, he assigned Marcus an analysis report so complex that it seemed designed to trip him up. The report required combing through hundreds of data points, aligning them with projections, and synthesizing them into actionable insights. It was the kind of task that would typically be handed to an entire team, but Alan placed it squarely on Marcus's desk, a smirk barely hidden behind his composed mask. "Have this ready by Monday morning," Alan said, his tone clipped. "We're presenting to the board, and there's no room for error." Marcus's eyes met Alan's, reading the challenge in them. "Understood," he replied, keeping his voice steady. The weekend turned into a grueling test of endurance. Marcus spent long hours at his home office, the glow of his laptop illuminating charts and spreadsheets as the night deepened around him. He worked methodically, pausing only to sip cold coffee or rub the exhaustion from his eyes. His phone buzzed occasionally with messages from friends checking in, invitations to join their weekend plans, but he ignored them. This report was everything. It was his chance to not just meet Alan's expectations, but surpass them. By Sunday night, Marcus felt the strain in every muscle, but he finally leaned back with a sense of completion. The report was thorough, detailed, and reflected the hours of dedication he had poured into it. Satisfied, he sent it to Alan's inbox and closed his laptop, letting exhaustion pull him into a restless sleep. Monday morning dawned cool and crisp, and Marcus entered the office with a cautious sense of pride. He took his seat, waiting for the moment when Alan would summon him. It didn't take long. Alan's voice cut through the low murmur of morning conversations. "Marcus, my office," he called, eyes narrowing as Marcus stood and made his way over. Inside, Alan sat with the report open on his desk, pages marked with hastily scribbled notes. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest as he prepared for the worst. Alan glanced up, his expression a practiced mask of scrutiny. "I see you completed the report," Alan said, flipping through the pages. His voice was even, but Marcus could sense the edge beneath it. "I'll admit, it's thorough." Marcus waited, knowing there was more to come. "But," Alan continued, leaning forward, "I'm not convinced it's boardroom ready. You've included too much detail. We need to simplify this for the executives. Less is more." Marcus suppressed a sigh, recognizing this for what it was, a thinly veiled attempt to diminish his work. "I can adjust the summary sections if needed," he said, keeping his tone professional. Alan's smirk returned, as if Marcus's willingness to comply was somehow a victory. "See that you do. And remember, Marcus, this isn't college. We don't care about how hard you work, only how well you fit the team." Marcus met Alan's eyes, the subtle jab hitting harder than it should have. "I understand." As Marcus left the office, a familiar anger simmered under his skin, but he pushed it down. Alan's words were meant to unsettle him, to make him doubt himself. But Marcus had learned that success wasn't just about showing up prepared. It was about staying calm under fire, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. The rest of the day passed in a blur of revisions and last-minute tweaks. Marcus made the necessary adjustments to the report, presenting it just in time for the board meeting. He watched from his desk as Alan walked into the boardroom, the report in hand. This time, Marcus felt a shift in his anticipation. It wasn't fear, but a quiet, unwavering confidence. Whatever happened next, Marcus knew he had done everything he could. As the board meeting stretched on behind closed doors, Marcus worked to maintain his composure. Every tick of the clock seemed amplified in the hushed office, each passing minute dragging his tension tighter. He glanced at the glass-walled conference room, catching glimpses of senior executives listening intently and Alan gesturing as he spoke. The report Marcus had poured himself into lay at the center of the table, a testament to his hours of effort. When the doors finally opened, executives emerged with polite expressions, their conversations muted and professional. Alan followed a few steps behind, his expression blank but eyes flickering with something unreadable. He paused as he caught sight of Marcus, a smirk lifting the corner of his mouth. "Marcus, my office," Alan called, his voice carrying that familiar condescending edge. Marcus stood and walked into Alan's office, ready for whatever would come. Alan shut the door behind him and took his seat, folding his hands on the desk. "The board was satisfied," Alan said, leaning back in his chair, his tone flat. "Your data provided a solid foundation, but don't let that get to your head." Marcus nodded, holding back the questions that itched to be asked. Why did every acknowledgement have to come with a sting? He clenched his jaw, but kept his face impassive. "While they liked the details, I had to step in to make it digestible," Alan continued, leaning forward with that habitual air of superiority. "You see, Marcus, there's more to being here than crunching numbers. It's about understanding your place in the chain." Something inside Marcus shifted, a long-held frustration sparking into resolve. He took a breath, eyes locking onto Alan's. "I understand my place, Alan," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm here to contribute, and I'm not looking for shortcuts or special recognition, but I am done pretending that your constant belittling is just part of the process." Alan's eyes narrowed, a shadow of anger creeping over his features. "Watch your tone, Marcus. You're on thin ice already." Marcus's pulse quickened, but he refused to back down. "No, I don't think I am. I've done everything you've asked, met every challenge, and proved myself at every turn. If that's not enough for you, then maybe the problem isn't me." A tense silence fell between them. Alan's face turned a shade darker, the controlled mask slipping. He stood abruptly, his voice low and sharp. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But you're still just here because someone upstairs thinks having a face like yours is good for PR. Don't mistake survival for belonging." The insult was as blatant as it was cutting. For a second, Marcus's vision blurred with a surge of anger, but he steadied himself, exhaling slowly. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about standing firm in the face of pettiness and prejudice. "I'm here because I earned it," Marcus said, the conviction in his voice unwavering. "And whether you choose to see it or not, doesn't change that." The finality in Marcus's words seemed to throw Alan off balance. For the first time, the manager's confident posture faltered, his eyes darting away as though searching for a retort that wouldn't come. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted the standoff. One of the senior executives, Mr. Carlyle, stepped in. He glanced between Marcus and Alan, brow furrowing slightly at the palpable tension in the room. "Alan, good work today," Mr. Carlyle said before turning to Marcus. "And Marcus, impressive analysis. We appreciated the clarity you brought to the figures." Marcus's eyes met Alan's, and he saw the unmistakable flicker of rage that Carlo's praise ignited. "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, the small victory soothing the sting of Alan's words. Mr. Carlyle nodded and left, leaving the office heavy with silence once more. Alan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Marcus took a breath, turned, and walked out, feeling a surge of energy rush through him. Today wasn't just about the presentation. It was about confronting the cycle of intimidation that Alan perpetuated and refusing to be broken by it. Marcus knew he had crossed a line, but he also knew that he had done so with integrity. Whatever came next, he was ready. The tension in the office simmered in the days following Marcus's confrontation with Alan. The story of Marcus stepping up during the presentation and standing his ground afterward had circulated quietly among the staff, sparking whispered conversations and nods of respect. But for Marcus, the true turning point was yet to come. One afternoon, an unexpected email from Thomas Johnson, the CEO of Sterling Solutions, appeared in Marcus's inbox. The subject line read simply, "Meeting at 4 p.m. Marcus's heart thumped in his chest. He hadn't spoken directly to his father since starting the internship, adhering strictly to their agreement to keep his identity under wraps. The timing of this meeting suggested that things were about to change. As 4 p.m. approached, Marcus straightened his tie and took a steadying breath. He walked down the hall to the CEO's office, noticing Alan near the water cooler with a few other managers. Alan's eyes flicked toward Marcus, curiosity momentarily overshadowing the usual disdain. Marcus felt a rush of anticipation as he pushed open the double doors to his father's office. The room was filled with a warm glow from the late afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows. Thomas Johnson stood by his desk, a tall and commanding figure whose presence alone could quiet a room. He turned as Marcus entered, a small, approving smile crossing his face. "Marcus, take a seat," Thomas said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Marcus sat, the subtle weight of his father's gaze reminding him of every conversation they'd had about strength and perseverance. Today it felt different, more public, more exposed. "I've been following your progress," Thomas began, his voice even but with a hint of pride. "And I know things have not been easy." Marcus nodded. "No, but I've handled it," he said, the memory of his recent standoff with Alan still fresh. Thomas's expression softened slightly. "I wanted you to prove yourself, not just to me or to the team, but to yourself. And you've done that, Marcus. But now, things need to change." Marcus's brows furrowed as he processed his father's words. Before he could respond, the door behind him opened, and Alan stepped into the room, summoned by an assistant who gestured for him to join. Confusion flickered in Alan's eyes as he took in the scene. Marcus sitting before the CEO, Thomas's expression unreadable. "Alan," Thomas said, his voice calm but commanding. "Take a seat." Alan obeyed, though his usual confidence was noticeably absent. He glanced between father and son, an uneasy realization beginning to settle in. "I called you here because it's time to clear the air," Thomas said, locking eyes with Alan. "Over the past few months, I've observed your interactions with Marcus. The pressure, the undermining, it's all been noted." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you, I was only holding Marcus to the same standards as everyone else." Thomas held up a hand, cutting him off. "Enough. You didn't know, but Marcus is my son." The silence that followed was heavy, every tick of the wall clock magnifying the shock that registered on Alan's face. His mouth opened, then closed, as he struggled for a response, the realization of his actions hitting home like a blow. "Your son?" Alan's voice was a strangled whisper, eyes darting to Marcus, who sat calmly, his face impassive. "Yes, my son," Thomas confirmed that, his voice growing colder. "And while I respected Marcus's wish to prove himself without revealing his identity, your behavior has made it clear that this secrecy has run its course." Alan's face flushed a deep red, the smugness he usually wore now replaced by panic. I didn't know, Mr. Johnson." "If I had known, it shouldn't matter," Thomas cut in sharply. "It shouldn't matter if he's my son or any other intern in this building. No one deserves the kind of treatment you've doled out. You've abused your position, Alan, and it stops today." Marcus watched Alan's eyes shift from fear to a desperate anger, then back to resignation, as he realized there was no escape. Thomas leaned forward, his gaze drilling into Alan. "Effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties." Alan's hands shook as he stood, his composure crumbling. Without another word, he turned and left the room. The click of the door closing behind him echoing in the silence. Thomas turned to Marcus, his stern expression softening. "You did well, son. More than well. I'm proud of you." A wave of relief and pride washed over Marcus. The truth was finally out, and he hadn't just survived, he had thrived. The office was electric the next day, buzzing with whispers and speculative glances as the news of Alan's abrupt firing spread. Employees exchanged knowing looks and hushed conversations, their curiosity stoked by the sudden, dramatic turn of events. Marcus walked through the corridors, aware of the shift in how people perceived him. Some regarded him with newfound respect, while others wore expressions tinged with embarrassment, recalling their silence when Alan had openly belittled him. For Marcus, the day felt lighter, as if the building itself had shed some of the tension it once held. He took his seat, focusing on the tasks ahead, but the quiet that now enveloped his workday felt almost surreal. No biting comments from Alan, no sideways glares or contrived obstacles placed in his path, just the steady hum of a workplace moving on from one of its more toxic figures. Julia approached Marcus's desk mid-morning, a half-smile on her lips. "Word travels fast, huh?" she said, her eyes sharp but kind. Marcus chuckled softly. "It does." I didn't know you were. She paused, searching for the right words. Well, who you are. That took guts, Marcus. He met her gaze and nodded. It's not about who my father is. I wanted to do this on my own terms. Julia's expression shifted to one of understanding. Well, you did, and it's good to see that people are finally recognizing it. Their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Carlyle, the senior executive who had commended Marcus during the presentation. He approached with an approving nod. Marcus, would you join me in my office? I'd like to discuss some of the upcoming projects. We could use your insight. A ripple of surprise passed through the nearby interns, who overheard, their eyes widening at the acknowledgement from such a senior figure. Marcus stood, a subtle thrill running through him as he followed Mr. Carlyle down the hallway. This was what he had been working toward, an opportunity to contribute meaningfully without the shadow of doubt cast over him. Inside Mr. Carlyle's office, the conversation was direct and encouraging. The executive spoke of Marcus's potential and praised the clarity he brought to the data during the presentation. We're moving in a new direction, Marcus, and I think you're exactly the kind of analyst we need, Carlyle said, the weight of his words underscoring just how significant the change was. Thank you, sir, Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady despite the excitement building within him. This was validation, not just as the son of the CEO, but as a professional who had proven his capabilities on merit. Meanwhile, Alan's departure left a void in the office hierarchy, and whispers about potential replacements filled the space where his authority had once loomed. While some employees speculated about who might take over, Marcus focused on his work, refusing to let the chatter distract him. He knew that whatever changes were coming, he had secured his place not because of his last name, but because he'd earned it. By the end of the day, Thomas Johnson made an unannounced appearance on the office floor. The energy shifted instantly, with employees straightening their posture and quieting their conversations. He approached Marcus's desk, nodding at the respectful silence that spread through the space. I thought I'd drop by to see how things are going, Thomas said, his voice low but carrying. His eyes met Marcus's, a shared understanding passing between them. Everything's going well, Dad, Marcus said, breaking into a smile. It was the first time he'd addressed his father so openly at work, and the acknowledgement drew a few surprised looks. Thomas nodded, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Good to hear. Keep up the excellent work. As Thomas left, a wave of subtle murmurs rose in his wake. The once hidden truth had transformed into an unspoken acknowledgement that Marcus was more than just another intern. He was capable, determined, and now, without a doubt, seen as a force in his own right. Marcus exhaled, the realization settling in. The long game was over, and he had emerged not just unscathed but victorious. The respect he had sought he had won through grit and perseverance, and the path ahead, once shadowed by uncertainty, now stretched out before him full of promise. Bookmark. In the days that followed, Marcus felt the weight of his journey lift as the office atmosphere began to change. People who once kept their distance now came by his desk to chat, seeking his input or just offering a quick nod of acknowledgement. Marcus embraced the shift, but remained focused, knowing that respect had to be maintained through consistency and hard work. The next week, an email landed in Marcus's inbox from the HR department. It was an invitation to a meeting titled Career Advancement Opportunities, and Marcus's eyes widened as he read the details. The meeting was meant to discuss potential roles beyond his internship, roles that would put him on the fast track to a permanent position within Sterling Solutions. Walking into the conference room at the appointed time, Marcus found Mr. Carlyle and two other senior executives seated at the polished glass table. They greeted him warmly, their expressions open and encouraging. Marcus, take a seat, Carlyle said, folding his hands on the table. We wanted to talk about your future here at Sterling Solutions. Marcus sat, his pulse quickening. The recognition from someone as seasoned as Carlyle was not just an achievement. It was a turning point. We've been impressed with your analytical skills and the way you handled the pressure during the last few weeks, Carlyle continued. The team needs fresh, insightful minds, and we think you would be an excellent candidate for a junior analyst role once your internship concludes. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest, but he kept his response measured. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. I'm ready to contribute wherever I'm needed. One of the other executives leaned forward, a smile touching her lips. You've shown resilience, Marcus, and that's something we value here. We think you have a bright future, not just as an analyst, but as someone who could grow into leadership. The words struck Marcus with their sincerity. All those late nights, tense moments with Alan, and the self-doubt that had crept in were now validated. The silence he'd kept about his identity and the battle to prove himself without leveraging his father's status had paid off. After the meeting, Marcus walked back to his desk with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun streaming through the tall office windows seemed a little brighter, the future a little clearer. Julie approached him, eyebrows raised in curiosity. "Good news?" she asked, noting the subtle smile that played on his face. "Yeah," Marcus replied, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "Just some updates about my next steps here." Julia's eyes sparkled with genuine happiness for him. "Looks like hard work does pay off," she said with a grin. "Congrats, Marcus. You deserve it." "Thanks, Julia," he said, appreciating her support. The quiet moments of camaraderie meant more now than ever. Meanwhile, word of Alan's departure continued to linger in the background, a ghostly reminder of the challenges Marcus had faced. Some employees speculated about Alan's whereabouts or whether he'd find a position at another company. Marcus chose not to dwell on it. His focus was on what lay ahead, not what was behind him. Later that day, Marcus received a text from his father. "Proud of you. Let's have dinner soon." The simple message carried a depth that only Marcus understood. It wasn't just pride, it was acknowledgement of the shared goal they had quietly pursued, to prove that Marcus's place at Sterling Solutions was earned, not given. The week wrapped up with a sense of quiet achievement. Marcus left the office on Friday evening with his bag slung over his shoulder, pausing to look back at the glass doors reflecting the city lights. For the first time since he'd walked into Sterling Solutions, he felt a deep sense of belonging. He hadn't just survived Alan's relentless challenges, he'd thrived, establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Marcus's name would stand for resilience, integrity, and capability. The future was his to shape, and he intended to make the most of it. Months passed, and Sterling Solutions continued to evolve. With Alan's departure, the office culture shifted into a more collaborative and supportive environment. Marcus thrived in his new junior analyst role, taking on projects that showcased his ability to tackle complex data with clarity and insight. Each completed task reinforced his place within the company and earned him recognition beyond just being the CEO's son. The lessons Marcus had learned through his struggles shaped his approach to leadership. He made a conscious effort to support the interns who followed in his footsteps. Remembering the feeling of isolation he had experienced, Julia had become a reliable colleague and friend, and their shared experiences created a camaraderie that made even the most stressful days manageable. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected message from the front desk. "A visitor is here to see you." Confused, he made his way to the lobby, where he found a man sitting stiffly in one of the modern chairs. The visitor's face was gaunt, his posture tense. Alan Turner. The sight of his former manager was a jolt, conjuring memories of confrontation and doubt. Alan stood as Marcus approached, an awkward silence stretching between them. The once confident manager now looked diminished, wearing a suit that had seen better days and eyes that carried the weight of regret. Marcus steadied himself, the anger he once felt replaced with curiosity. "Marcus," Alan began, his voice lacking its former sharpness, "I wasn't sure if you'd agree to see me." Marcus's expression was guarded, but civil. "I was surprised, yes. What brings you here?" Alan shifted, glancing at the polished floor as if searching for words. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I wanted to apologize for everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus took a breath, assessing the sincerity in Alan's eyes. The man before him was not the domineering figure who had belittled him, but someone humbled by the consequences of his own actions. "I appreciate that," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "It's not easy to face what you did." Alan nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I've had a lot of time to think. I lost everything, my job, my reputation, but what I regret most is how I treated people. especially you. I let my own insecurities and prejudices cloud my judgment. For a moment, the lobby's usual noise seemed distant as Marcus processed Alan's words. Forgiveness wasn't simple, but Marcus knew that holding on to resentment would do little to change the past. He met Alan's gaze, the corners of his mouth softening. "We all make choices," Marcus said. "Yours taught me resilience, and for that, I grew stronger. I hope you find a way forward that lets you be better." A flicker of gratitude crossed Alan's face, and he extended his hand. Marcus hesitated only for a second before shaking it, a gesture that closed the chapter between them. As Alan turned to leave, Marcus felt an unexpected lightness. This was closure, not just for the challenges he had endured, but for the part of himself that once doubted his place at Sterling Solutions. Later that evening, Marcus sat at dinner with his father, the city lights twinkling through the restaurant's window. Thomas raised his glass, eyes full of pride. "To lessons learned and new beginnings," he said. Marcus clinked his glass with his father's, a smile breaking across his face. "To new beginnings." The past months had transformed Marcus in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had faced prejudice, proven his worth, and emerged not just as the CEO's son, but as a respected professional in his own right. Now the future stretched before him, filled with opportunities not just for his own success, but to create a path for others to follow. And as the night deepened, Marcus knew that while his journey at Sterling Solutions had started with a test of perseverance, it would continue with a promise to always stand tall, no matter the challenges. The story of Marcus at Sterling Solutions is one of resilience, integrity, and the transformative power of facing adversity with unwavering determination. From his first day as an intern, battling prejudice and skepticism, to his emergence as a respected leader, Marcus's journey offers valuable lessons. The challenges imposed by Alan Turner tested Marcus's patience and character, but ultimately strengthened him, proving that perseverance and hard hems. This narrative reminds us that everyone has their battles, whether it's proving themselves in the face of doubt, standing tall against unfair treatment, or choosing the path of integrity even when it's hard. Marcus's journey is a testament to the idea that success isn't just about skill but about character, how one chooses to act when faced with challenges. His story encourages us to believe in our own worth. Alan's downfall serves as a reminder that arrogance and a lack of empathy can lead to self-destruction. While he eventually realized his mistakes, it came at the cost of his career and reputation. On the other hand, Marcus's actions teach us that even when the road seems daunting, staying true to oneself can lead to the ultimate reward, earning respect. Marcus's transformation from a determined intern to a promising leader symbolizes the importance of perseverance and kindness in professional and personal spaces. His resilience not only brought him recognition but inspired change within the company, leaving behind a legacy that encouraged future employees to approach their work with empathy. If you found this story inspiring, comment with a 1. If you thought it was very inspiring, comment with a 2. We'd love to hear about your experiences and stories as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more stories full of inspiration and life lessons. Share your thoughts about Marcus's journey in the comments below. We'll go back.